and welcome to the first of two debates that we're producing on the ballot measures that are up for consideration on November's election. My name's Steve Johnson. I'm the director of the Seawolf Debate program here at the University of Alaska Anchorage, and I'm very pleased to be partnering tonight with the Anchorage Daily News and the UAA Votes project to bring you these debates. The Seawolf Debate program does a lot of work in this area. In addition to our competitive team, we have a pretty robust public service agenda where we host opportunities for young people to get involved with competitive debating. We produce public debates on issues like this for Alaskans and do our best to cultivate good quality civil discourse for our state and for the residents of our state. Several things I'm going to talk to you about tonight. First, I'm going to spend some time talking to you about the topic that we're going to be debating. Then I'll turn our attention to the format of the debate that we're going to use. I'll introduce our debaters, and then finally we'll get off to the races by hearing their arguments for and against the motion. The motion for our debate is Alaskans will benefit from passing the Alaska North Slope Production Tax Increase, also known as the Fair Share Act, ballot initiative. Alaskans are unique among the residents of the other 49 states in many ways, perhaps most significantly in this way. They likely know more about the taxation of natural resources than do most of their fellow Americans. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, Alaska is oil, and oil is Alaska, at least as far as our government is concerned. According to the Resource Development Council for Alaska, oil production has funded up to 90% of the state's unrestricted general fund revenues for most years and has accounted for over $180 billion in total revenue since statehood. In 2019, the oil and gas industry paid over $3.1 billion in state and local taxes and royalties in FY 2019, including $2.7 billion to the state government and $449 million to local governments. Yet, as we're painfully aware, the contributions that oil makes to our state's revenues is declining, presently to around 25%, due to decreased production and lower prices. But that we continue to depend upon oil to fund the life we've come to enjoy in Alaska is undeniable. The other reason that we tend to know a lot about oil taxation is that it seems that every couple of years we get a refresher course on how oil taxes work. Changes to our oil tax structure are as predictable as salmon returns, yet nowhere near as fun. The last 30 years have produced a veritable alphabet soup of oil tax regimes. ELF and PPT and ACES and SB 21 are among the most recent approaches to have been in place, and those are only a few amongst the various laws that have been passed to govern taxation of oil and gas since the first production tax was passed 4 years before Alaska became a state. It's likely no surprise, therefore, that something with as long a history and in which so many have a stake would be quite complex. The change proposed by Ballot Measure 1 boils down to two new taxes. Ballot Measure 1 would apply to three well-known fields on the North Slope: Alpine, Kaparak, and Prudhoe Bay. As summarized by the official language that will appear on the ballot, for those units, the state would receive revenue from the greater of one of two new taxes. One tax would be a tax on the gross value at the point of production of oil at a rate of 10% when the oil is less than $50 per barrel. This tax would increase to a maximum of 15% when oil is $70 per barrel or higher. No deductions could take the tax below the 10 or 15% floor. The other tax, termed an additional tax, would be based on a calculation of production tax value for the oil that would allow least expenditure and transportation cost deductions. This tax on production tax value would be calculated based on the difference between the production tax value of the oil and $50. The difference between the two would be multiplied by the volume of oil, and then that amount would be multiplied by 15%. The existing per taxable barrel credit would not apply. The Act uses the term additional tax, but does not specify what the new tax is in addition to. The Act would also make all filings and supporting information relating to the calculation and payment of the new taxes a matter of public record. This, then, is the measure that we'll debate when contemplating our motion for today. Alaskans will benefit from passing the Alaska North Slope Oil Production Tax Increase, also known as the Fair Share Act, ballot initiative. We'll interrogate this motion in a debate organized around 3 phases. In the first phase, we'll allow each of the advocates a series of speeches to develop their cases for and against this motion. We'll begin by hearing from the proposition side, and then alternate between the proposition and the opposition speakers until each of the 4 speakers has had an 8-minute opportunity to establish their position. In phase 2, we'll open the floor to questions posed by journalists who specialize in oil issues. I'll moderate to be sure that each side gets a fair shot at responding to those questions. And that question or that phase will last about 15 minutes. In the final phase of the debate, we'll provide each team 1 4-minute summary speech to close their position. In this phase, the con side will speak first, and the pro side will have the last word. Let's take a second now to meet our debaters. Arguing on behalf of the proposition for the pro side are Senator Bill Wielechowski and Robin Brena. A state senator since 2006, Bill Wielechowski represents East Anchorage and Jay-Bear interests in the Alaska State Legislature. Senator Wielechowski has been active on veterans issues, management of the permanent fund dividend, and, appropriate for this debate, policy surrounding revenues generated from Alaska's natural resources. He's joined on the pro side by Robin Brena. Mr. Brena is a longtime oil and gas attorney who served as chairman of the Oil and Gas Subcommittee for the Walker Administration Transition Team. He's chair of the Vote Yes for Alaska's Fair Share group, which sponsored and is supporting Ballot Measure 1. Arguing against the motion are Roger Marks and Tom Walsh. From 1983 to 2008, Mr. Marks was a petroleum economist for the Alaska Department of Revenue. According to Kara Moriarty of the Alaska Oil and Gas Association, when Roger worked for the state in 1989, he believed taxes were too low and worked on changes to the economic limit factor. She goes on to say that he believed taxes were still too low in 2006 and worked on the PPT. He's since retired, but Ms. Moriarty reports that he supported SB 21 because he thought ACES was too high. In short, he spent a lot of time thinking about oil and taxation in the state of Alaska. And importantly, he has no financial ties to the oil industry. He's joined on the con side by Tom Walsh. Mr. Walsh is a founder and managing partner of Petrotechnical Resources of Alaska. A geologist by training, Mr. Walsh has been involved in the exploration, appraisal, or development phase of many of the major oil fields in North Alaska and has extensive experience in all of Alaska's oil and gas basins. Mr. Walsh's current interest focuses on resource assessment of gas hydrate accumulations, and he served as principal investigator on a recently completed study of the resource potential of gas hydrates associated with the Barrow gas fields on the North Slope. Mr. Walsh recently managed a multidisciplinary team of oil and gas experts in drilling a methane hydrate test well on Alaska's North Slope. Rounding out our participants tonight are 2 journalists, joining us to ask questions of each of the teams in that interaction phase during the debate. First, we have Alex DeMarman. Alex is a longtime Alaska journalist with the ADN who covers business, the oil and gas industries, and general assignments. He's joined by Elwood Bremer. Mr. Bremer is a reporter with the Alaska Journal of Commerce who covers the energy and political sectors in Alaska. Finally, before we kick off the debate tonight, I have a number of thank yous that I'd like to offer. First, I'd like to thank the Anchorage Daily News for their support of the informed dialogue that's relevant to all Alaskans. I want to say thank you to the UAA Votes project, organized by the University of Alaska Anchorage's Department of Student Life and Leadership, for helping us navigate the UAA's COVID risk mitigation regulations. And I want to say thank you to the Atwood Foundation and North Rim Bank for their sponsorship of the Great Land Debate Fund, an effort to support the debate education and events that benefit Alaskans young and old. With all of those thank yous and all of that material out of the way, I am pleased now to call the House to order, to invite our first debater from the pro side to approach the podium to issue the speech on behalf of the motion.
In 2013, the Alaska State Legislature passed Senate Bill 21, which dramatically cut Alaska's share of our oil wealth. This bill was perhaps the most massive transfer of resource wealth in state history, transferring billions of dollars from Alaskans to the oil industry. We now receive the lowest share for our oil in state history. In exchange, Alaskans were made a series of promises. Alaskans were promised 1 million barrels of oil per day. In fact, they named SB 21 the More Alaska Production Act. The oil industry promised Alaskans more jobs, more investment, more revenue to the state, and a growing permanent fund. The oil industry spent tens of millions of dollars on TV ads, radio ads, mailers, Facebook ads, convincing Alaskans that we'd be better off taking billions less for our oil. Supporters of this transfer of our oil wealth said, give it a chance. And Alaskans are trusting people. We gave them that chance. So here we are 7 years later. Did they honor their promises? Instead of 1 million barrels per day, oil has dropped below 500,000 barrels per day for the first time in state history, even before the pandemic. And there is no rebound in sight. Did they keep their promises on jobs? Just 4 weeks after the citizens' referendum, BP slashed 475 oil jobs at a time when oil prices were near $100 per barrel. The oil industry has since cut another 5,000 jobs while increasing the percentage of non-residents working on the slope. Did they keep their promises on investment? At Prudhoe Bay, investment dropped from $826 million to $202 million. Slope-wide over the last 4 years, capital investment is the lowest in a decade. Did they keep their promises on more revenue to the state? In the last 5 years, after factoring in tax credits, the industry has had a negative production tax rate. And did they keep their promises on the permanent fund? We all know the answer to that. The PFD was cut just 2 years after Senate Bill 21 crippled 80% of our state revenue. Under SB 21, the oil industry has taken about $1 billion per year in deductible oil tax credits. That's equivalent to every man, woman, and child giving up roughly $1,500 of their PFD every single year to the oil industry. That's $6,000 in lost PFDs for the average family of 4 every single year to the oil industry. And what have we gotten for that? Thousands of fewer jobs, billions less in investment, billions in lost revenue. So where did that money go? Did the oil companies reinvest it in Alaska? Since SB 21, 68% of ConocoPhillips' worldwide profit was made in Alaska, yet they've only reinvested 15% of their capital in Alaska. Instead, Alaska's oil wealth is being used to fund jobs and investment in Texas, North Dakota, Malaysia, Libya, Indonesia, and China. While we have seen our permanent fund dividends cut 2/3, ConocoPhillips increased their dividends to their shareholders by 60% in the last 2 years. While Alaskans have been forced to use billions in savings in the last few years to make up for our oil revenue losses, ConocoPhillips paid off $12 billion of their debt. And while we have seen draconian cuts to our marine highway system, education, pre-K, public safety, snow plowing, the university system, and more, ConocoPhillips increased their stock buyback program authorization from $10 billion to $25 billion. By any metric, this oil wealth giveaway has been a catastrophic policy failure. It's not like we didn't see this coming. When we were debating this oil wealth transfer in 2013, we asked for commitments in the legislature, in statute, to require more jobs, more Alaska hire, more investment, more production, and more state revenue. The oil industry opposed every single one of those requests, and the legislature compliantly listened. There's a long history of the legislature trusting the oil industry to do the right thing, and a long history of the oil industry choosing their corporate shareholders over Alaskans. In fact, a judge once accused the Alaska government of, quote, inexcusable trustfulness with the oil industry in a case where the oil industry refused to pay billions of dollars in royalties to the state. You can't really blame the oil industry for trying to make as much money as they can. That's their job. But you can blame the legislature for not insisting that we get a fair share for our oil and a fair share for our shareholders, the people of Alaska. And now, here we are again. The legislature has had 7 years to fix this bill. We have a constitutional obligation to get the maximum benefit for our resources, yet the legislature has refused to fix these well-known easy to fix problems. When amendments have been offered on the floor to fix these things in the legislature, oil companies' supporters have said, this should be fixed in a bill that goes before a committee hearing. When bills are then filed, they refuse to give them committee hearings. Under the Alaska Constitution, when the legislature abdicates its responsibility, when it refuses to fix a problem, the people of the state have a constitutional right to fix it themselves. That is what this initiative does. It's a simple bill, this initiative. It only applies to 3 fields: the Prudhoe Bay Unit, the Kapark River Unit, and the Colville River Unit. It does 4 things. It requires transparency of financial data. Right now, as a member of the Senate Finance Committee and a former member, co-chair of the Senate Resources Committee, I can't even find out how much profit an oil company makes in the state of Alaska. I can't find out what their expenses are, what their net present value are. This is information the oil companies routinely provide around the world, but in Alaska, the policymakers are asked to make critical policy decisions while blindfolded. This bill fixes that. This bill cuts deductible oil tax credits. In recent years, we have been allowing about $1 billion per year in tax credits and getting nothing in return. This bill closes a loophole that allows oil companies to deduct costs unrelated to producing oil from their units. Lastly, the current production tax is 4%. This bill raises that to 10% and increases that slightly as prices rise. But even this is still below the 12.5% tax rate that was in effect for decades. And while the oil companies are spending tens of millions of dollars to try once again to convince Alaskans to take far less for our oil, the oil industry will still pay less than what they have paid if this initiative passes for decades. With no production taxes net of credits, Alaska's royalty and tax share is currently about 12.5%. It's a far cry from the 33% share Governor Hammond insisted we get. It's less than half what the oil companies pay in Texas and North Dakota. When this initiative passes, Alaska will get 22.5% of the value of our oil at most oil prices. This is still below our historical average of 27%, still below Texas, still below North Dakota. And remember, this initiative only applies to the 3 most profitable fields in Alaska. It's time we acted like a sovereign and not a colony. It's time we heeded the words of Governor Wally Hickel and act like an owner state that we are. It's time we heeded the words of Governor Jay Hammond and insist we get our fair share. I hope you'll join me in supporting Ballot Measure 1 to ensure we get a fair share for our oil. Thank you.
Many Alaskans would agree that maximizing long-term state oil revenues is in Alaska's best interest. So how do you get there? You cannot put 100% tax on oil. There'd be no reason to invest, and production would decline rapidly. So what is the appropriate tax? In the early 1960s, the state could have established its own state-owned oil company, but instead opened up the North Slope to the world through the competitive bidding process. Development was subject to market forces, and being competitive was essential to attract investment. There are many dimensions to competitiveness, including cost, geology, and fiscal terms. So what happens when a fiscal system is not competitive? Alaska has tried that before more than once. In the 1989 oil tax change, just like the Fair Share Act, it targeted high tax rates for big fields. There was a short-term revenue boost, but within months, producers were switching their investments from high tax to low tax fields. And existing fields, once you stop investing, production goes into free-for-all. The tax became anemic, production and revenue dropped, and the only difference between then and now is now they can switch investments to federal acreage where state royalties are much less. And then there was the ACES regime between 2007 and 2014. At higher prices, ACES had one of the highest tax rates in the world, and when oil prices escalated in 2008, while producers made good profits here, they were making much more everywhere else. There were plenty of opportunities outside Alaska. The state also made lots of money for a few years, but paid a price, and in fact, as we'll see, they're still paying that price. The rate of increase in capital investment here was a fraction of what occurred worldwide. That whole era bypassed Alaska. During ACES, production dropped 200,000 barrels per day. And if we look at slide 1, on the left-hand side of that graph, you can see the drop in production that happened under ACES. On the right-hand side of the graph, the dotted line shows that state production forecasts they made in 2013 under ACES. For 2020, they showed production dropping to 400,000 barrels a day, and this was at a forecasted price of $122 a barrel. And the solid line on the right shows what actually happened under SB 21. Before the pandemic for 2020, the state was on track for 500,000 barrels a day at a price of $64 a barrel. This is 100,000 barrels a day more at a price $60 less. The additional barrels are also paying income taxes, royalties, and property taxes, and the state is making more money now than it would have under ACES. So how does the Fair Share Act stack up for competitiveness? Many economists measure competitiveness with what's called government take. It's percentage of pre-tax profits that go to government and include all state and federal taxes and public and private royalties. If you look at slide 2, the bottom axis here is oil price and the left axis is government take. The bottom line shows the average government take for oil states in the lower 48. It can be considered the competitive norm. The middle line shows the tax currently. It's above the norm at low prices, above the norm at high prices, and competitive in the middle. And the top line shows the Fair Share Act. It's way above the norm. At current prices, it's a 150% tax increase. At $65 a barrel would be a 350% tax increase. The Fair Share Act has been plagued by certain accounting approaches which in my judgment are problematic. There's a number of these and they're listed on slide 3 and which shows these claims, and I'll discuss those now. Fair Share Act claim number 1. SB 21 led to the decline in state revenues and jobs after 2014. Oil prices dropped from $108 a barrel in 2014 to $43 2 years later. Revenues and jobs would have dropped under any tax regime. Claim 2, the state would get $1 billion a year more under the initiative. That was true at $65 a barrel oil prices. At current prices, the initiative would bring in about a quarter of that, and long-term future prices are not much different than today's. Claim 3, Alaska's oil profits are extraordinarily high. Alaska operations are 100% oil. Everywhere else, they're 50-50 oil and natural gas, with gas being a distinct low-value business. The reported combined oil and gas per unit profits elsewhere is diluted by gas. You cannot assess the relative profitability of oil by comparing it to gas. In recent years, there have been billions of dollars in write-offs in the lower 48 on gas assets, which directly reduce profits. If you look at ConocoPhillips' annual report, their Alaska production and transportation costs and taxes are high. ConocoPhillips currently have lots of fields under development on the North Slope. There's Willow, Norwal, Fuyard West, Greater Mooses Tooth 2, Nuna, East West Sac, and Harpoon. Had it not been for ACES, many of these would be producing now. If the initiative passes, ConocoPhillips, I suspect, will hit the pause button on these. Under accounting rule, the depreciation deductions from the billions of dollars they've spent exploring, delineating, and developing these fields do not show up on their income statements until they start to produce. Per ConocoPhillips' latest annual report, their future profits in Alaska are less than the lower 48. It would be sadly mistaken to believe that Alaska is dealing from a position of strength in raising taxes. Claim 4, the state is entitled to 1/3 of gross revenues. This is clearly stated on the Fair Share Act website and drives the terms of the initiative. Let's look at slide 4. At a $60 market price, gross value was $50. That's a market price less transportation. And this pie chart here shows the distribution of gross revenues at the $50 gross values under the initiative. Gross value includes the upstream costs. As we see here, they take up nearly half the gross value, and if the state is getting 1/3, there's not much left for the taxpayers. That's how you get a 350% tax increase. Claim 5, other states have higher combined tax and royalty rates. Alaska is a high-cost place to do business. Because of greater distance to market, it has higher transportation costs. Because it's a remote and hostile environment, it has higher capital and operating costs. The producers in other states have lower costs and make more money than in Alaska, even with those higher tax and royalty rates. That's why those states can command higher rates. Again, you have to consider the costs in evaluating taxes. Claim 6, the per barrel credit is a subsidy or a giveaway. Under ACES, the tax rate was 25%. SB 21 increased the tax rate to 35%, but at the same time put in the per barrel credit that declines as prices increase. It makes for higher tax rates at higher prices and lower tax rates at lower prices. The same thing could have been done in a progressive tax table like the IRS has without calling it a credit. The per barrel credit and the higher tax rate were engineered to work together to create the competitive rates we saw in slide 2. The Fair Share Act gets rid of the per barrel credit but keeps that 35% rate. As a result, the Fair Share Act has higher tax rates than ACES at prices up to $100. Frankly, I did not think anyone believed ACES was not high enough. Claim 7. The North Slope producers paid no production tax between 2015 and 2019. Actually, they paid over $2 billion in those years. At the same time, credits that are now phased out went to non-North Slope producers and small North Slope explorers that also totaled $2 billion. What this claim does, it offsets the taxes paid by one set of entities with credits received by another. This initiative is directed at the fields that paid the tax. If you're aggrieved by the fields that didn't, the question you must ask yourself is, what does voting for the initiative do? To sum up, there may be other standards for an appropriate tax besides competitiveness. The Fair Share Act has not demonstrated any. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for sponsoring this. And I appreciate the debate and the comments. Senate Bill 21, as Mr. Senator Wielechowski said, is the largest resource giveaway in Alaska's history. We're getting less in our production taxes than ever. We're getting less in production taxes than when Bill Allen was bribing legislators in the legislature to lower our production taxes. We have never done a worse job of being stewards of our oil resources than we're being today. Mr. Marks is one of the people that supported that massive oil giveaway and is continuing to try to justify it. So let's just go through his representations to you and just talk about him. Number one, he loves to point out that ACES brings in a little more at real low oil environments. What he failed to mention is that for every dollar that Senate Bill 21 brings in that environment, it gives up $100 in other price environments. That over the same period of time, ACES and Senate Bill 21, the difference in revenues would have been $11 billion, which is the entire savings that we've blown away trying to sustain Senate Bill 21 when it's not sustainable for Alaska. So it's a completely false premise to point out that ACES somehow would have resulted in less revenue over any period of time that's relevant for Alaska. He talks about on slide 2, the tax increase. Under our current oil environment, the taxes are going to go from 4% to 10%. So I will join him. How do you determine what a fair share is? We get our fair share from two primary sources: royalties and production taxes. Our royalties are 12.5%. They're half of what other oil resource states get. Half. Then there's production taxes. Since Senate Bill 21 has been in effect, Alaska has been in an economic tailspin. It's been chaos up here. We have ferries stacked up outside of Cordova that can't provide service to communities that don't have roads. We have people leaving the state because they don't believe their children can be educated in Alaska anymore in K through 12. We're at the University of Alaska, and it is being systematically gutted along with the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. Alaska is being dismantled while our oil wealth is leaving the state for free. He mentioned representations. Problematic accounting is what he referred to it as. Let's talk about those. But before I do, let me just summarize. We get half of the royalty that other states get, and we haven't got any production taxes in 5 years net of credits. None. We've paid them more in credits than they've paid us in production taxes. We have paid or owe them $2.1 billion in this period in awarded credits, and they have paid in total $2 billion. So what if it's a different set of producers? If I owe the moderator $100 million and I get $50 million, I'm $50 million behind, and Alaska's a lot more than that behind. So what are the misrepresentations that Mr. Marks is advancing this time? And let me say that every single promise that was made with regard to the last time has proven false. But let's just go through them today. State revenues fall after 2014 because of Senate Bill 21, and he assigns it to oil taxes. Nothing makes me more upset than the way that the oil companies wrote a tax bill. It worked brilliantly for them. It resulted in the complete collapse of Alaska's revenue, and now they want to blame it on oil taxes. The 5 years before, we brought in forget about credits, $21 billion. Net of credits, $19 billion. 5 years after, we would have brought in forget about credits, $2 billion, and with credits, negative. So and what did the price of oil do in this period? The price of oil between the earlier 5-year period and the later 5-year period dropped by 35%. Our production revenues collapsed by almost 110%, and the price of oil declined by 35%. What's happening to Alaska isn't because of the price of oil, and you may have noticed that the price of oil went back up in the middle of this in the mid-70s. And Alaska didn't recover because Alaska can't recover anymore because they've gutted progressivity out of the production tax. So as the price of oil goes up and as their profits go up, we don't get any more for it. The price of oil can't save us anymore because we gave away progressivity because the bill they wrote gutted it. So his first point is wrong. The initiative will bring in $1 billion a year. We have specifically modeled what the Fair Share Act will do compared to Senate Bill 21 for the last 5 years. For the last 5 years, Senate Bill 21 brought in negative $84 million net of credits. The Fair Share Act would have brought in an average of $1.1 billion. And by the way, when we went from that $19 billion to zero, that's $3.8 billion a year we used to get and nothing now. That is why Alaska is suffering. That is why our ferries are stacked up. That is why your permanent dividends are a third of what they should be. That is why we're losing jobs and don't have a capital budget. Because Senate Bill 21 gutted our production taxes and now we're giving away our oil to Texas companies who are spending millions to talk us into doing it again. The oil profits are extraordinarily high. ConocoPhillips makes twice as much in Alaska as they do anywhere else. And we've demonstrated that a couple times. The state is entitled to a third of gross. That's what Hammond said the deal was, a third, and a third. When Governor Palin was our governor, we got 38% of gross. We're now getting 12.5%, while Texas is getting a third and North Dakota is getting a third. We are getting a third to a half as much as oil states used to get, and we used to get more. Combined royalty and severance taxes in other states are higher than Alaska. There isn't a single thing that you've heard. It's our oil, it's our land, it's our state. We need to get back our fair share. Please join us in doing that. And by the way, you also heard the word government take. One comment on government take. If you hear the word government take during any of these debates going forward, someone's about to misrepresent something to you. Our royalties are half, our production taxes are gutted. The federal income tax went from 35 to 21%, gave them a $500 million windfall. And they're talking about the government take too high in Alaska. There is no government take in Alaska. Royalties are not taxes. And so here's a quote from a Senate study that did an analysis of the competitiveness of different fields. When used as a sole criterion to determine the competitiveness of particular oil and gas jurisdiction, government take can be quite misleading. It is not an economic indicator. The take is a statistic and a rather imperfect one. Those who are unfamiliar with its shortcomings of the government take as a criteria tend to overuse it. Please don't be persuaded by millions of dollars of misinformation. Stand for Alaska. Stand for getting our fair share back. Alaska demands it. Thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity to participate in this debate this evening. This is an extremely important issue that we're facing in the state of Alaska right now. And I do have some slides that I had prepared. I think I'll be throwing those out the window because I've got to respond to some of the issues that have come up here in the two speakers for the pro side. I want to address the issue that Alaskans will benefit from this initiative. Alaskans will not benefit from this initiative. This is bad policy created in back rooms, created in a vacuum by a handful of people without any public debate over it, except for these types of debates. It's like Senator Wielechowski going down to Juneau and saying, I've got a bill, we're not going to debate it, we're not going to put it before committees, we're just going to vote on it, and we're going to pass it. It's just not the way to do government policy. This is a critical issue, and it's not something that a few guys should be taking on. It's obvious that Senator Wielechowski is frustrated by his years in the Senate down in Juneau and not being able to get the tax law right. And now he's teamed up with an attorney who has made his fortune out of suing the oil industry. It's just, I can see why they are so wrapped up in this, but I think we need to set the record straight. This is not good for Alaskans. There's been no financial modeling by the sponsors, although Robin Brena just mentioned that their models show these various facts that he's pointing out. I've talked to their economist early on, and he told me that there was absolutely no financial modeling to see what the impact of this would be on the oil industry and what it would do to jobs and oil production and so forth. This bill will harm Alaskans, not benefit, and the initiative is far from fair. The fair share, this is not a fair initiative. This is basically punitively going after the major producers on the North Slope of Alaska, and particularly one who's been so active in exploring and producing and reinvesting in Alaska. It's also got collateral damage imposed on other companies that really have nothing to do with this, who haven't benefited from 50 years of production at Prudhoe, and Hillcorp is a great example of that. Here they've just bought BP Alaska. They're coming in as the operator of Prudhoe Bay. They've had no experience with Prudhoe. They've had no benefit over the years of all this money being taken outside, as Robin would say. They're coming in to change the paradigm for Prudhoe Bay. And as they're negotiating this issue with the former operators and owner of Prudhoe, BP, this tax initiative comes along. Change the ground rules completely. It will impact their efforts at Prudhoe. It will impact their efforts in a negative way at Milne Point. The idea of ring fencing, which is embedded in this bill, is something that I haven't heard either of the proponents talk about this evening, and hopefully it's because they recognize that it's absurd. The idea of saying, we don't want you to take any profits from Prudhoe Bay and invest them in Pika, Willow, Alpine, any of these other fields, you've got to ring fence them and spend them only in that location, it's a disincentive to exploration. It's a disincentive to development, and it's a disincentive to production. The only outcome of that can be less production, less activity on the slope, less jobs, and less revenue for the state. Senator Wielechowski is a member of that legislature that he's blaming now for not acting. And I think that's so ironic to hear him say that. The idea of the going from 4% to 10% gross floor on the gross tax is something that's so punitive, and basically at low oil price, oil companies will be paying tax when they're losing money. And who else pays tax when you lose money? If you are paying personal income tax and you have no income for the year, you wouldn't pay the federal government a personal income tax. So I think it's really crazy for this initiative to push that up to 10% and 15% at higher oil prices. The gross tax is not a good idea. The state does not invest in the oil industry in Alaska. The state takes money from the benefit of the oil industry, whereas other jurisdictions actually build roads, build pipelines, build infrastructure. We don't have that up here, and the state is not an active partner in investing in the state of Alaska, and that's all up to the oil industry. So anything that goes on the North Slope, ice roads, gravel pads, pipelines, it's all at the cost of the industry. And that's why the net profit tax is appropriate, because there's a huge amount of investment going on. And if you shut off the pipeline to provide revenue for that investment to go on, that revenue will dry up. I think that, obviously the proponents don't really understand how the oil industry works, but the oil industry does the investing, and they get a fair share of their profits at this point. But if you change the law the way that these folks want to do it, it will have devastating effects. I'm going to skip my second slide, slide 6, because Roger already covered these claims, but I think that what we're hearing is a lot of throwing out of numbers by the proponents without the financial modeling. Go to their website and look for the financial modeling that shows what the impact of this is going to be. You won't find it. That is something that I've never seen in discussion of changes in tax law before. Typically, there are significant efforts to look at what the impact is going to be and try to avoid collateral damage. Ring fencing came up in a previous legislative bill, HB 111, and I believe it was taken out because it's just such a bad idea. Now it's resurfaced again in this initiative. My third slide, slide number 7, shows the core fields that we're talking about here, Prudhoe Bay, Kuparuk, and Alpine. And what it shows is that those fields are producing 80% of the North Slope oil production. And to put those fields at risk and to say, we're going to change your tax structure and basically shut down the engine that is the economic driver of this state is very scary to me. I think that it's the wrong thing to do. It will have major effects on those 3 fields. It will also almost immediately impact 2 of the new fields that we're hoping will come online in the next few years, Pica and Willow, in that they intend to produce over 40,000 barrels a day, and they are estimated to contain more than 400 million barrels. So they are immediately on the chopping block as soon as this legislation goes through. And the incentive for them then would be to reduce the total size of those fields or reduce the production output. So there are many flaws. My last slide, slide number 8, covers some of the flaws that we see in the initiative. It's a disincentive. It creates more tax, less investment, less production, and that means less revenue for the state and less jobs. Its collateral damage will impact Milne Point, Willow, Pica, Narwhal, and other new fields that might come online that we're looking to fill the gap. It's a punitive tax on volatile and struggling industry. We've worked this issue for so long and keep trying to reduce the output from these fields and tax them more, and it's simply the wrong thing to do. I hope that you'll vote no on Prop 1. Thank you.
So you've had the chance now to hear some of the arguments for and against by the advocates from the pro and the con side. We're going to take a pause in the debate right now to give a chance to the journalists who've been listening so far to ask some questions of the debaters, of the teams, of the individual arguments that have been made so far in the debate. So we will proceed through this for about 15 minutes. I'm going to moderate, do my best to make sure that everybody gets a fair chance to answer those questions. And I think the 2 of you have talked amongst yourselves. And Alex, I believe you were going to pose the first question. So to whom would you like to ask that, and what would you like to ask?
I'd like to ask kind of a broad overview question to both sides.
Sure.
The state in recent years has gotten around $400 million annually in production taxes, and even less is predicted for the state in the years to come, while ConocoPhillips alone has made about $1.5 billion in the last few years in net income. And so if you can add in Exxon and Hilcorp, the other large producers that this proposal targets, then maybe you would say that the oil companies, the major oil companies alone are making about $3 billion in net income annually. So maybe $3 billion in net income annually to the producers in the years to come, and maybe $350 million to the state. I would just ask why this is fair to the state, based on what we know from what other states receive.
All right, that sounds like a question the con side might want to take the first shot at. So
sure, and I think if you refer to
my slide where I showed government take.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that shows what the state is receiving.
Right.
That's the of the net revenues, the pre-tax revenues before taxes.
Right.
That's the percent that's received in other states versus what the state is receiving now. At low prices, the percent the state's getting is way above that. So,
And you're counting royalties in that, though, and royalties are costs that that the oil companies would pay anywhere. So I don't think that that's necessarily relevant. I'd like to.
well,
see
sure,
us
sure,
focus
royalties
on
are
production
relevant. I mean,
taxes.
what if the royalty was 20% versus 40%? That would be relevant. Royalties are relevant. That's what they pay, and some of these other states, in Texas and North Dakota, most of those royalties are private. It's not what the government's getting. I put this on sort of an apples-to-apples basis in terms of what they're paying, but in terms of what governments are actually receiving in Texas and North Dakota, most of those are private.
Okay. Thanks.
If you take a look at slide 5, you can see 2018 what the actual profit was for Prudhoe Bay alone. $2 of the $3 that's brought in under the Fair Share Act is because of Prudhoe. Prudhoe is the crown jewel of Alaska's wealth. We can't screw up Prudhoe, or we've really screwed up Alaska, and we're screwing up Prudhoe now. So there is what happened in 2018. They brought in $3,683 million in Prudhoe alone, and our share of production taxes was $229.7 million. There isn't anything fair about that, so there isn't anything fair. We're getting a third of what other states are getting. So your question is just spot on. And I noticed in the article you wrote the other day, you pointed out that the forecast of the spring forecast had $114 million forecasted under their assumptions going forward. You know, they have taken $10 billion, between $10 and $11 billion of our oil out of our state each year. And they're leaving behind, nothing in production taxes. And so that what is fair about nothing? There is nothing fair about nothing.
Elwood, how about if we give you a chance to
Roger
pose a
was going
question?
to respond.
Sure, thank you. I guess there's been a lot of mention of this clause in the bill, or policy of ring fencing. It's sort of a secondary issue behind the top line tax rates. Robin, just to be straightforward, is there any other industry where a company is not allowed to take a profit from one sector of their business and invest it in another to grow their business?
There isn't anything preventing them from taking profit from any field in the world and investing it anywhere they want in the world. Ring fencing doesn't restrict investment at all. What ring fencing does is says that if you're going to deduct a cost from the revenue produced by a field, the cost needs to be related to producing the oil at the field. That is a common concept, and in this case, they mention Pikka. Pikka has no production. We have the new explorers that don't get a massive tax break when they're outside the units. So if you want a level playing field and you don't want a heavily subsidized playing field for just the first players that got here, the legacy producers, you have to ring fence to be fair. And what happens with ring fencing is it just keeps rolling your profit forward. We're building NPRA. We're building Willow. We're building it with our money, and it's on federal lands. And we're about to have a $300 to $400 million a year increase in our deficit because they're taking what should be our profit, our share out of Prudhoe, and they're investing it by costs completely unrelated to Prudhoe in these other fields. So all the producers ought to have a level playing field when they're out of the unit, and we shouldn't be playing winners and losers like we're playing now. And if you want to deduct something from Prudhoe, then it ought to be related to Prudhoe and not just roll that forward to Willow and then roll that forward to Anwar and then roll that forward till we never get our oil, till we never get our share.
Let's give Mr. Walsh a chance. He's the one that addressed that in his speech. I'd like to hear from him on that question.
I would just like to say that I think the idea of leveling the playing field, it sounds great. You don't necessarily want to level the playing field. What you want to do is incentivize activity and create more revenue by creating more oil production. And ring fencing does just the opposite of that. It says you can't take profits from here and invest them over here. First of all, we're going to take $1.2 billion away from you to begin with. Just take that out and call it tax and put it in the state revenue. And then whatever's left, you have to invest right there in that field. You can't take it elsewhere. But I think the other thing I'd like to correct, if I can, real quickly, is the idea that the state's problem is the oil industry taking too much money out. The problem for the state is that we are producing a declining commodity. Oil will eventually go to zero production up here. And we are setting a horrible precedent by saying, well, we don't really care what the impact of this is on the existing production. We're just going to keep ratcheting up the taxes. If you ratchet up the taxes as you have natural decline in the fields, it's going to collapse the oil industry and it's going to accelerate the decline of those fields.
Mr. Brena had a comment to respond to that.
The idea that we're ratcheting up taxes on these fields, after the Fair Share Act passes, the average production tax will be less than it's been for 3 decades before Senate Bill 21. We are not even going to make it to the 27% average production that we've had for 3 decades up here. We're going to end up with 10% on 12.5. We're going to be at 22.5%. We're going to be 5% under our average for 3 decades. And when you talk about one thing about Prudhoe, you got to focus on Prudhoe because the Fair Share Act doesn't even apply to Willow, doesn't even apply to Pica. It just says that Prudhoe Bay, we give $750 million. I'm talking about our PFD, I'm talking about our ferry system. We give $750 million in credits for them to produce out of Prudhoe Bay for production that would have happened anyway. Investment in Prudhoe under Senate Bill 21 went from $826 million in 2013 to $202 million. We're getting a quarter as much investment in Prudhoe as we used to get, and we're giving them $750 million to invest $200 million in Prudhoe, and that is, for no reason at all. That oil's been produced. Prudhoe was developed when oil was $3.38 a barrel. The oil would be produced anyway. It's their legal obligation to produce it, and they would produce it anyway without a penny of that incentive. Why are we giving away $750 million for Prudhoe Bay to produce? That's ridiculous.
On that note, I'm going to give it back to the con side to give them a chance to respond because I did give the pro side an extra chance. Mr. Marks.
One note about Prudhoe Bay. Prudhoe Bay does have, the initiative applies to 3 fields, Prudhoe Bay, Kapparik, and Alpine. Prudhoe Bay does have lower costs than these others too. Alpine and Kapparik, their costs are about $30 a barrel. And so the question you have to ask is, why is this initiative applying to Kapparik and Alpine the same way it applies to Prudhoe when their costs are extravagant?
May I answer?
A brief answer, yes,
Okay.
before we'll turn back to our journalists.
First, ConocoPhillips' 2018 annual report referred to all 3 fields as our low-cost legacy production fields. All 3 fields are low-cost. Mr. Marks says that it's $30 a barrel out of Alpine. We don't know what it is out of Alpine and Prudhoe because we don't have transparency. Unless the Fair Share Act passes, we will never know what the margins are for Kapparik or Alpine again, because they have less than 3 active producers in them. So if you want to really know how we're doing in those 2 fields, vote for the Fair Share Act and find out. We know about Prudhoe still, and so we need to get past this misinformation, and we need to get real numbers, and the only way we're ever going to get real numbers is through the Fair Share Act.
All right. Let's go back to our panel and see if there's another question. Alex, I think it was your turn if you'd like.
Yeah, I'll ask this to both sides, but I'll ask this to Robin Brena's side first. But so our economy is about in the worst shape it's ever been, or maybe going in that direction here in Alaska. And $1 billion annually in extra taxes is a big jump. ConocoPhillips, though they've done well in recent years here in Alaska, but they're currently losing money right now, according to their second quarter report. And oil companies have a lot of ability to slow roll new projects, to slow production, to control things, like they say, and create a reality like they say will happen, which is less production, less new projects. So how do you ensure that higher oil taxes won't result in a halt to new projects and the spending that creates so many critical jobs in the state?
Well, first, Alex, I want to be sure that we don't create the misimpression that it brings in $1.1 billion every year, regardless of the price of oil. So what happens is if the price of oil goes down, for example, if the price of oil were $20 a barrel, then North Dakota would get $2. Senate Bill 21 would get 20 cents. The Fair Share Act would get $1 a barrel. So it ratchets.
Generally, $1 billion is.
So first of all, it's not $1 billion in hard times. It's $1 billion on average over all times.
Yeah.
Over the last year. So and that just reflects. And like I said, that's lower than our average. I mean, so it's not a big increase. It's a modest increase after a massive decrease.
Well, we have to think about today's
is what it
economy,
is.
Not
and so
the
today,
economy 30 years ago.
it only affects 3 fields. Okay. There isn't any investment in Prudhoe Bay. They're just milking it. It's a cash cow and they're harvesting it. And that was what the Petroleum News said 20 years ago when BP shut down its production office. So Prudhoe Bay is going to continue to produce at minimum levels of investment because the investment's been recaptured decades ago and it's a very low cost field. We have to get our fair share out of Prudhoe Bay. That doesn't hurt investment in Prudhoe 1 penny. And the same with Kuparuk and Alpine. These are some of the most profitable conventional oil fields in the world. You can't get $20, $30 margins anywhere else. The Alaskan wide, we make twice as much profit up here as ConocoPhillips makes in the lower 48. Compared to the Middle East, they get $5 a barrel and they're getting 25 or 30 out of Alaska. So this isn't going to, we're still, after the Fair Share Act, they're still going to be making more money in Alaska than anywhere else in the world.
Somebody from the con side want to take on that question? That was a core theme of the arguments you were making. So do you believe that this act will necessarily cripple the oil industry's ability to invest and develop new fields, and how so? Sure.
I'll take a quick
Yeah,
stab
I'll
at it.
ta-
First of
you
all,
take a
it
stab and
just
I'll
makes
take a stab.
perfect sense. If you take $1 billion out of the revenue stream for oil companies, you can't do that with any industry in the world and not have it impact investment. It will have impact on investment, Robin. And I can tell you that from experience. I've seen it time and time again. When oil price collapses, when taxes go up, it will impact what money is invested in these fields, and it will impact production. And the other thing that I think you're really missing the boat on in terms of total revenue, 20 years ago we were putting 2 million barrels down the pipeline. We're putting less than 500,000 barrels of oil down the pipeline right now, as you suggest. That is going to go down if there's not significant investment going forward.
Mr. Marks, did you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah,
too?
during the ACES era, I was at a conference and talked to someone and mentioned I was from Alaska, and he said, Alaska, that place is poison. The way the world saw ACES as a confiscatory act of not too much different than what Venezuela does. After the ACES experience, I don't believe the state has another opportunity to play bait and switch with the producers, enticing them with one tax rate and then jacking up the tax rate once the fields are operating. You mentioned, Texas. Texas, things are going gangbusters in Texas with those high royalty rates you talked about. Texas has not changed their tax system in over 30 years.
Senator Wielechowski, I saw you raise your hand on this question, then Mr. Brena will get you too.
We've heard this sort of theme that low taxes will lead to more investment. And this has played out in Alaska. We actually had an old tax structure called the ELF, where production taxes at Kuparuk over a 10-year period dropped from 12.5% down to 0. And you would think if that philosophy was true, if that was accurate, that production would have exploded. But instead, production went down. Production plummeted right along with the tax rate. Look at Cook Inlet. Cook Inlet has an oil tax rate of 0. if that were the case, that low taxes would lead to more production. You have huge amounts of oil in Cook Inlet. There is virtually no production coming out of Cook Inlet. So this idea, we've actually had professors testify in front of the Alaska legislature that the severance tax has very little to do with production rates, very little to do. And so this idea that you're going to lower taxes, we're seeing it right now. We lowered the taxes with SB 21. We gave away billions of dollars, and look at production on the North Slope. It's not increased. In fact, the slide that Mr. Marks referenced about this production forecast, he's using a production forecast from 2013. If you go back a year or two, actually, the production rate tracks almost identical to what the production is now. And that's because the Parnell administration rigged the production tax forecast. This was a huge area of dispute during that time. A number of us in the legislature contested this. Go back 2 years and look at the production forecast from just 2 years before this production forecast was rigged, and you'll see it tracks pretty darn close to where we are today.
No,
Well, we
Mr.
do
Brena,
have
I know
two
that you wanted-
major
did you
fields
have a
Brief comment.
Very, very brief, because we're getting close to time.
The last 4 years of investment, we've been giving away our oil, and it's been the lowest investment in Alaska in the last decade. So we're getting less investment than we got under ACES. And so this idea that give us your oil and we'll invest, well, we bought that once. We bought it and we lost 15,500 jobs in Alaska, 5,500 in the industry. They couldn't cut jobs fast enough after we gave away our oil. So keeping $1.1 billion in Alaska is the economic equivalent of 11,000 jobs at $100,000 a year. That's more jobs in the entire oil industry. That's going to be a huge thing. And one final point, and then I'll end.
Very quickly, please.
Okay. ConocoPhillips invests a little over $1 to make $1 in net income out of Alaska. Okay, ConocoPhillips invests $13 in the lower 48 to get $1 of net income out of the lower 48. We are so competitive and capital efficient up here. It's unbelievable. And this humdrum of high cost and high capital, that's not the case. We have mature fields. They're harvesting them. We need to get our share from them.
Thank you.
ConocoPhillips is investing heavily, and we do have 2 new fields that could come online soon, including possibly Willow starting next year. So
Neither of which the Fair Share Act applies to for a decade if they hit peak production.
although Conoco could decide to just slow down.
Yeah. Well, Governor Hammond had, you know, how do you determine when their bluff is a bluff and when it's not? You know what he decided in his book? He said, if I had it to do over again, I'd start at 99% and I would lower it until the drill started humming, and then I would stop there. We're sitting at 4% that they're in court arguing should be 0. And we're intimidated. We've given away all our oil. We're paying them more than they're paying us, and we're sitting here intimidated because they may leave investment from the most profitable region that they have in the world. Come on, Alaska.
We're going to head back and check in with Elwood to see if there's anything that you'd like to close on, because you've only had one question so far. We're almost out of time, but I'll give you a chance to ask that final question.
I'll leave this one for Senator Wielechowski, since this is all about, statewide policy. And you mentioned I think you used the word obvious in your opening statement that SB 21 is a failure. If it is so obvious, why haven't you been able to drum up enough support in the legislature to get maybe not the Fair Share Act, but some other tax change to increase revenue?
You want to know why? I'll tell you why. When I talk privately to legislators, when I talk privately to very conservative legislators, when I talk privately to legislators who supported Senate Bill 21, they're voting yes on this. And they're voting yes because they know it's been a catastrophic failure. They're scared to death to go public on this because they know the oil industry will target them. They know the oil industry will throw tons of resources at them to take them out in their elections. That's the reason why you're not seeing more people come out. You're seeing leadership block these bills. I actually filed the same identical bill to this, to this Fair Share initiative in the legislature. I requested hearings on it. I requested that we have an opportunity to have a public airing of this. And there's some criticism of the fact that this was done behind closed doors. This initiative was written in consultation with over a dozen people, former legislators, former president of the Senate, former resource co-chairs. But I tell you, the legislature is scared to death of going up against the oil industry. But privately, there are many of them who are going to be voting yes.
Let me ask the con side if you'd like to respond to that question as well. They asked about why SB 21 has not been overturned if, as Senator Wielechowski claims, it is so obviously bad for Alaska. Any opinion on that?
In my judgment, SB 21 is a successful tax and getting a competitive share of revenues that line up or greater than what happens in the competition.
Mr. Marks?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to know who it is that you think is afraid of the oil industry in the legislature. You've stated a couple of points there that these people are going to vote for this initiative. That can't be proven. I just think that the reason it's not passing in the legislature is because it's bad policy.
If I could respond to that,
very briefly,
it'd be great to have. It would be great to have a hearing on this. I mean, that's what we asked for, is let's have a hearing on this and have an open debate. And the legislature refused to do it. And so you can't pass something when you have leadership who receive huge amounts of campaign contributions from the oil industry, who the oil industry goes to bat to get elected, and then is whispering in their ear, don't have a hearing on this. It's pretty hard to get a bill passed in that scenario.
It has been proven. A federal district court in Alaska has held that the oil industry's influence in our political structure is so overwhelming that we're uniquely subject to quid pro quo corruption and the appearance of it. And that was the factual finding. The U.S. Supreme Court just recently referred to that finding in sending back a case to the Ninth Circuit, saying you need to, pointing out that holding. So it's not only been proven what it is, but it's disproportionate. And the factual findings are available for everybody to see. And the state put on the case that there was a disproportionate influence on our political structure from the industry. And that's why we're here, and that's why there's an initiative, because we are captive, we are colonized by foreign companies, and it's time to throw a little tea in the harbor and get our share back.
In the interest of fairness, I'll give one more chance to the con to respond to that, or to what Senator Wielechowski or to Mr. Brena had just said.
Well, I would like you to put a little meat on that and tell us who you think it is that's corrupt in the legislature right now and who is held captive to the oil industry. I think you're fabricating these things. Sure, there have been issues in the past, but I think to make those claims and say that's why you have to go out to the initiative process because we failed in the legislative process, I think you need to put a little more meat on that.
We've had a bill sitting before the legislature, 129, begging for a hearing. They had a hearing on the Fair Share Act, and they wouldn't even invite us to talk. The Senate leadership hired somebody and told them not to talk to anybody, not to review the bill that was pending before them, and point out every ambiguity they could. Come on, Tom. We all live in the same world. You don't think the oil industry has influence? Why are you even here?
I'm here because I want my kids to have jobs in this state, and I want to see this state thrive, and I want to see the oil industry as healthy as it can be. And this bill will kill the oil industry.
And
Clearly a great deal of heated opinions on either side, and I appreciate both sides' willingness to engage on those questions, and thank you especially to our journalists for posing those questions and getting that discussion going. We are going to give each of our sides now a chance to summarize their position in a brief summary speech. Those speeches will be 4 minutes apiece, and we're going to allow each team one of those speeches. So each of the teams has designated one of their two speakers to give their summary speech. It's the tradition in academic debating and in policy debating in general that those who are proposing get the opportunity both to make the first case for it and to have the last word on that issue. So our first summary speech is going to go to our con team. We're going to turn it over to them and hear from them first, and then once they're done with their summary speech, we'll turn it back to our pro side team to hear their position on it as well. Mr. Marks, 4 minutes on the clock whenever you're ready.
You have heard from us how the Fair Share Act would adversely affect every investment decision on the North Slope, all of which would reduce production. This is from things like having less cash because of higher taxes, better opportunities outside Alaska, deferral of deductions, switching investment from high tax to low tax fields, and perverse incentives to keep production down, slow production down, and develop fields outside of existing units. The giant Willow and Pikka oil fields explored and delineated by ConocoPhillips and Oil Search have yet to be sanctioned. They were deferred because of ACEs. If developed, they could add 300,000 barrels a day and thousands of jobs, but will require $10 billion of investment. Similarly with Anwar, if it's ever developed. Again, the state does not have another opportunity to play bait and switch with producers with ballot initiatives. Over the last hour, indeed over the last year, we've heard very little from initiative sponsors in regard to Alaska's high costs, investment response to the initiative, and competitive government take. Now, government take is something all economists look at fiscal systems look at. I recently bought a textbook on oil fiscal systems. There were about 200 references to government take in it. We listed how the foundation of Ballot Measure 1 was rooted in approaches to accounting that are amiss. One I'd like to focus on is fair share cannot possibly be historical shares of gross revenue when costs and prices have varied widely. What Governor Hammond said was a third of the resource pie, not gross revenues. The resource pie means net revenues. Hammond understood that costs are part of gross revenues and should be excluded from the allocation of the revenues. And we talked about progressivity. I'd like to direct everyone's attention to slide 2 again and look at the bottom line and the middle line. Worldwide, there's a tacit arrangement between producers and governments in terms of risk symmetry, sharing risk. There are progressive systems where the taxpayer takes the downside risk, gets the upside potential, and there's progressive systems where the government takes the downside risk but gets the upside potential. If you look at the bottom line, which is the gross systems in the lower 48, that's a downward sloping line, and that's where the taxpayer is taking the downside risk and lower as prices get higher, taxes get lower, and it gets the upside potential. Look at the middle line, the Alaska line. This is under the current system. It has a high take at low prices and a high take at high prices. It's a heads I win, tails I lose system. It's the only jurisdiction in the world that I know of that has a risk symmetry like that. And that's under the current system. The initiative makes it worse. We mentioned accounting problems that the initiative has, and I was just astonished that the speakers invoke those accounting problems in their presentations. A couple of them I want to particularly focus on is why state revenues fell after 2014. During the ACES era, prices were up to $150 a barrel. In 2016-17, they were in the 30s. In conclusion, you cannot yank hundreds of million dollars out of investor cash flow without them modifying their behavior. Competitiveness may not be the only standard for structuring a tax, but when we tried the experiment of not being competitive, it failed. We start out today suggesting maximum long-term revenue is in Alaska's best interest. Instead, the Fair Share Act will make a small short-term dent in the budget gap, which would lead to very big long-term financial problems for which Alaskan citizens will have to pay down the road. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Alaskans for listening to this. I appreciate your attention. I appreciate your courtesy. I believe that Alaskans are trying to get this right. I'm an Alaskan that stands for that Alaskans should get their fair share of the oil. There's 5 things about the Fair Share Act that I want to just bring home. Applicability. It only applies to the largest, most profitable fields in North America. Doesn't apply to Willow, doesn't apply to Pikka. Won't impact their economics at all. In fact, when I met with Oil Search about Pikka, one of the things that I explained to them, I met with 5 people for 2.5 hours. One of the things that I explained to them is how much better does it get? The political risk of doing business in Alaska is massive because we can't take care of our own financial house. And so here's a situation where we're going to generate some more revenue from our largest, most profitable field, and we're not going to impact your development at Pikka by a penny and impact it. We're going to lower your political risk and make a more favorable environment for you to invest in. Second thing the Fair Share Act does is raise a minimum rate from 4 to 10%. This won't even return us to our average share over the last 3 decades. It's less than our average, and it's less than our sister states that are major oil resource states. It's entirely reasonable. It eliminates the $8 revenue credits. The legislature went back when it addressed credits. It threw all the independents under the bus on the awarded credits, but it kept paying the credits for the major fields that didn't need them at all. So there is no economic justification whatsoever to be giving Prudhoe Bay $750 million when it's been producing oil for 3 decades with no credits at all. We're giving our money away. They're giving your PFD away. They're giving you the cost of maintaining the ferry system. They are gutting Alaska so that we can pay credits for oil that would be produced anyway. Cost deductions. Costs unrelated to these major fields shouldn't be deducted from their profit. Progressivity. As Alaskans' share should increase as the price of oil and producer profits increase. They eliminated that. Transparency. Alaskans should know the revenues, costs, and profits for our major fields. And I want to just focus on how will Alaska benefit. This is $1.1 billion a year on average. If you're concerned about your permanent fund or PFD, you have to vote yes. The reason that we have a permanent fund, the reason we have PFD at all is because we've received a fair share from our oil revenues over the last decades. Essential services, the ferry systems, everything that's being cut in Alaska. If you care about Alaska, if you care about your children's education, if you care about the University of Alaska, Anchorage, if you care about UAF, we can't give away our oil and maintain a modern Alaska. And that goes for all of our children. Jobs. There hasn't been a capital budget since Senate Bill 21 passed, and there won't be. $1.1 billion is the economic equivalent of 11,000 additional jobs for 100,000 a year. If you take that times a multiplier effect of 5 or 6, it will create $6 to $7 billion of economic activity within Alaska. That's what happens when you keep more of our wealth in Alaska rather than allow it to leave Alaska. And then finally, so it will create massive jobs, and because it relates to these fields only, these massive, highly profitable fields, it will not interfere with investment in those fields. And the fields that are outside those fields have the same economics after the Fair Share Act as they did before. And finally, who do you think is going to be left holding the bag if we don't get a fair share for our oil? I can just tell you, it's you. You are going to be the one that pays taxes. You are going to be the one that gets your PFD cut. You are going to be the one that's going to be facing an income tax, a sales tax. You are going to live in municipalities where the state is trying to take the revenue source, the fish tax, the petroleum, the property taxes from them. So you want to know who's going to benefit? Alaskans are going to benefit from the Fair Share Act. Thank you.
So I want to offer a number of thank yous to all who participated and made this event possible tonight. First of all, to the Atwood Foundation and North Rim Bank for supporting Seawolf Debate and the Great Land Debate Fund that makes events like this possible. To the Anchorage Daily News and UAA Votes for partnering both on the production and the promotion of this event. And most importantly, to all of those who participated in this debate here on the stage tonight. To our journalists, Alex DeMarvin from the Anchorage Daily News and Elwood Bremer from the Alaska Journal of Commerce. To our debaters from the pro side, Mr. Brena and Senator Wielechowski, and to our debaters from the con side, Mr. Marks and Mr. Walsh. Thank you all so much for taking the time to help us understand this complex issue and the arguments for and against it. As I always say at the end of events like this, remember that the best debate is one that doesn't end conversation but begins them. So I encourage you to continue to have these conversations with your family, your friends, your neighbors, and that we all come to the best decision for the state of Alaska and our future. Thanks, everyone.